Louis XIV of France once sat down alone and finished 4 plates of soup, an entire pheasant, 2 thick slices of ham, a plate of pastries, and a bowl of fruit before anyone else at Versailles had cleared their first course. His sister-in-law watched the whole thing and wrote it down because she could not believe it. Number 14 involves a Roman emperor who demanded a dish so bizarre that his own guards killed him before he turned 19. The meal behind number 8 took hundreds of cooks working through the night to prepare, and number 1 was the last thing a king ever ate. What royalty put on their plates tells you more about power than any throne or crown ever could. Hit subscribe, because these stories go places no history class ever took you. Here are 25 meals actually served to kings and queens behind palace doors. Number 25. Roasted whole boar. Long before silver service and printed menus, the most powerful signal a king could send was the size of the animal on his table. In Anglo-Saxon England and across early medieval Europe, a whole wild boar, hunted by the king himself, was roasted on a spit over an open fire pit and carried into the great hall on a wooden plank by 4 men. The boar's head was the centerpiece, often presented with an apple or a quince wedged between its jaws. Serving it meant the king had land to hunt on, men willing to risk injury bringing the animal down, and a kitchen large enough to roast something that could weigh several hundred pounds. The meat was dense, dark, and intensely flavored, nothing like domestic pork. Guests tore pieces from the carcass with their hands. There were no individual plates. The boar was the plate. Number 24. Roasted crane. In medieval England, the bird that landed on a royal table said everything about the host's rank. Crane was reserved for the highest tables. The birds were hunted with trained falcons across the marshlands, brought to the palace kitchens whole, and roasted on iron spits over open fires. Cooks basted the meat with butter and spices, then served it with a sauce made from ginger, vinegar, and mustard seed. Crane meat was dark, lean, and tough compared to chicken or goose, but that was beside the point. Eating it meant you had access to the falconers, the marshlands, and the kitchen staff required to prepare it. The meal was never about flavor. It was a display of reach. A lesser noble served duck. A king served crane. Number 23. Kumis. On the Mongolian steppe, Genghis Khan and the rulers who followed him drank kumis, a thick, sour, mildly alcoholic drink made from fermented mare's milk. Fresh milk was poured into leather bags and left to ferment over several days, stirred or beaten regularly to encourage the process. The result was a fizzy, tangy liquid with the consistency of thin yogurt and roughly the alcohol content of weak beer. Mongol rulers drank kumis by the gallon. It was served at every feast, every council, and every celebration. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Mongol court were offered it as a test of respect, and refusing was considered an insult. Marco Polo, visiting the court of Kublai Khan generations later, described it as the drink of choice for every important occasion. For a civilization built on horseback, the horse provided not just transportation and warfare, but the royal drink. Number 22. Saffron rice at the Safavid court. The Safavid emperors of Persia treated saffron the way European monarchs treated gold leaf. Palace kitchens in Isfahan prepared enormous platters of steamed rice dyed bright orange with saffron threads layered with slow-cooked lamb, barberries, and pistachios. Each platter was built in a mound and inverted onto a serving dish so that the crisp golden crust, called tadig, formed the crown on top. Saffron was harvested by hand from crocus flowers, each bloom producing only 3 tiny threads, and the quantities used in a single royal banquet would have taken workers days to collect. The rice was not a side dish. It was the main event, and the depth of its color told every guest at the table exactly how much the host was willing to spend on a single meal. Number 21. The Royal Surasang. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, the king ate according to a ritual so precise that every dish, every bowl, and every utensil had a designated place on the table. The surasang was a formal table set with 12 side dishes, 2 types of rice, 2 types of soup, stew, grilled meat, steamed vegetables, kimchi, and fermented sauces. Each meal was prepared by a team of palace women called surigan, who trained for years before they were allowed to cook for the throne. The king ate 5 times a day, and every meal followed the same structure. A royal taster sampled each dish first. Silver chopsticks and spoons were used because silver was believed to change color in the presence of poison. Whether that actually worked is debatable, but the fear behind it was real. Assassination by poisoning was common enough in the Joseon court that no king ate a meal without someone else trying it first. Number 20. Stewed lamprey. Henry I of England loved lamprey so much that it may have killed him. Lampreys are eel-shaped, jawless fish that latch onto other animals with a circular mouth lined with rings of teeth. In medieval England, they were considered a delicacy for royalty. The fish were caught in rivers, gutted, and stewed in wine with pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. The texture was rich and fatty, closer to organ meat than to any fish you would recognize today. Henry reportedly gorged on a full dish of stewed lampreys against the advice of his personal physician. According to the chroniclers, he fell violently ill shortly afterward and died within days. The exact cause is debated by historians. Some blame food poisoning, others suggest the lampreys aggravated an existing condition, but the story stuck, and for centuries afterward, English royalty continued eating lamprey anyway. The fish was too prestigious to give up, even after it had allegedly taken down a king. Number 19. Gilded sugar subtleties. At the court of Elizabeth I, the most extravagant dish at any royal banquet was not meat or fish, it was sugar. Tudor-era palace kitchens employed specialists called sugar workers, who sculpted elaborate centerpieces out of sugar paste, marzipan, and edible gold leaf. These creations, called subtleties, could stand several feet tall and were shaped into castles, ships, coats of arms, animals, and even portraits of the queen herself. They were placed at the center of the banquet table, and guests were expected to admire them before anyone touched the food. The sugar used in these displays was imported at enormous cost. In the 16th century, refined sugar was more expensive by weight than most spices, and a single banquet subtlety could use dozens of pounds of it. Elizabeth herself was known for her fondness for sweets. Ambassadors noted that her teeth had gone black from sugar consumption, a detail recorded in more than one diplomatic dispatch. But the decay was almost a status symbol. Only the wealthiest people in England could afford to eat enough sugar to ruin their teeth, and the Queen's blackened smile was visible proof of her access to the most expensive ingredient in Europe. The subtleties were never meant to be nutritious. They existed to demonstrate that the crown could afford to waste more sugar in a single evening than most English families would see in a year. After the guests had admired them, the sculptures were broken apart and eaten, or simply thrown away. At one recorded feast in 1561, a visiting French delegation was presented with a sugar model of a fully rigged warship, complete with masts and sails, all of it edible. The French ambassador called the display astonishing, but noted in his private letters that the food itself was ordinary. The sugar was the message. Everything else was just dinner. Number 18. Xocolotl. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, one of the first things his soldiers recorded was the drinking habits of the Emperor Montezuma II. According to the account written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, Montezuma drank xocolotl, a cold, bitter chocolate beverage, from golden goblets. The drink was made from roasted cacao beans ground into a paste, mixed with water, chili peppers, and vanilla, then frothed by pouring it back and forth between two vessels until a thick foam rose to the surface. It was nothing like modern hot chocolate. It was dark, spicy, unsweetened, and served at room temperature. Montezuma reportedly consumed dozens of goblets each day. The cacao beans themselves were so valuable in Aztec society that they doubled as currency. A single turkey could be purchased for roughly 100 beans. The emperor was not just drinking chocolate, he was drinking money. Number 17. Bird's nest soup. The emperors of China's Ming and Qing dynasties ate bird's nest soup, made from the dried saliva nests of cave swiftlets. The nests were harvested from the walls of limestone caves across Southeast Asia, a dangerous job that required climbing bamboo scaffolding hundreds of feet above the cave floor. The nests were soaked, cleaned, and simmered in a broth until they dissolved into a gelatinous texture. The flavor was mild, almost neutral, and the appeal was entirely about rarity. The nests were so difficult to harvest and so expensive to transport that only the imperial household and the wealthiest families could afford them. Chinese court physicians also prescribed bird's nest soup as a health tonic, claiming it strengthened the lungs and improved the skin. Whether those claims held up did not matter much. The emperor ate it, and that was recommendation enough. Number 16. Stuffed dormice. In ancient Rome, wealthy households and imperial banquets featured a dish that strikes most modern diners as startling. Dormice, fattened in special clay jars, then stuffed with minced pork, pine nuts, and a fish sauce called garum, and roasted until the skin crisped. The practice is documented in the Apicius, the oldest surviving Roman cookbook, which includes a recipe for gliers, the Latin word for the edible dormouse. The jars used to fatten the animals, called gliraria, had air holes and internal ledges so the mice could move, eat, and grow in the dark. Dormice were not peasant food. They were a mark of excess. Roman sumptuary laws at various points actually banned serving them at banquets, not because of any cruelty concern, but because legislators worried the display of wealth was getting out of hand. The emperors ignored the ban. They always did. Number 15. The blackbird pie. Medieval European banquets featured a dish that sounds like a nursery rhyme because it eventually became one. Palace cooks baked a large pie crust, hollow inside, with a small opening cut in the top. Just before the dish was presented, live songbirds were placed inside the shell. When the host cut into the crust at the table, the birds flew out across the banquet hall. The spectacle was the entire point. The pie itself was often inedible, just a stage. A separate, real pie was served afterward for eating. Italian and English courts both practiced versions of this, and some accounts describe frogs, rabbits, or even dwarfs emerging from enormous pie shells at royal celebrations. The tradition survived for centuries because it did exactly what royal dining was designed to do. It turned a meal into something nobody at the table would ever forget. Number 14. Flamingo tongue. The Roman Emperor Elagabalus took the imperial table to a place that disturbed even his own court. He ruled from roughly 218 to 222 of the Common Era, ascending to the throne at the age of 14, and by every surviving account he used the banquet hall as a stage for excess that bordered on performance art. Among the dishes he demanded was flamingo tongue, a delicacy that required butchering an entire bird for a sliver of meat no larger than a finger. The tongues were extracted, cleaned, boiled in broth with cumin and coriander, and served in small piles as a single course among dozens. Elagabalus did not stop at flamingos. The Historia Augusta, a Roman biographical collection, records banquets where he served camel heels, coxcombs torn from living roosters, and the brains of ostriches and parrots, all on gold plates. He reportedly ordered roses scattered so thickly on the dining room floor that guests waded through them, and on at least one occasion, according to the same source, The petals were dropped from a false ceiling in such volume that several diners suffocated beneath them. Historians debate how much of the Historia Augusta is reliable, and some of the more extreme claims may have been exaggerated by later writers hostile to his memory. But the core portrait of a teenager using food as a weapon of spectacle is consistent across multiple sources. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard at the age of 18. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber. The banquet stopped, but the recipes survived, and they tell you everything about what happens when absolute power meets an appetite with no one left willing to say no. Flamingo tongue was never about nutrition. It was a dare, served on a plate, by a boy who understood that waste itself was a form of authority. Number 13. Whale meat. In medieval England, every whale that washed ashore or was caught in English waters was legally the property of the crown. The head belonged to the king and the tail to the queen. This was not symbolic. Royal kitchens actually prepared whale meat for the table. The flesh was classified as fish by the church, which meant it could be eaten on fast days when red meat was forbidden, making it doubly valuable to a court that observed dozens of meatless days each year. The meat was typically boiled or roasted, then served in thick slices with a peppery sauce. Descriptions from the period suggest it was tough, oily, and strongly flavored. But taste was beside the point. Whale was reserved for the monarch by law. Every bite was a reminder of who owned not just the land, but the sea around it. Number 12. Iced desserts at the court of Catherine de' Medici. When Catherine de' Medici left Florence to marry the future King Henry II of France in 1533, she brought Italian confectioners with her. Among the techniques they introduced to the French court were frozen desserts, flavored ices made from fruit, sugar, and snow packed in salt. These were not the smooth ice creams of later centuries. They were coarse, granular, and intensely sweet, closer to what would eventually be called sorbet. The snow had to be hauled down from the mountains and stored underground in straw-lined pits. Producing a single course of iced desserts for a royal banquet required a supply chain that stretched from alpine peaks to the palace kitchen. Within a generation, frozen sweets became a fixture of French aristocratic dining. The rest of Europe followed. What arrived as an Italian curiosity in the luggage of a teenage bride became one of the defining luxuries of the European royal table. Number 11. Pineapple. When Charles II of England was presented with a pineapple in the 1670s, it was among the rarest foods ever placed on a royal table in Europe. The fruit had been brought from the Caribbean and kept alive during the voyage, an expensive logistical operation that made it more valuable by weight than most precious metals of the era. A famous painting, attributed to Hendrik Dankerts, depicts the moment the pineapple was offered to the king, and the fruit stands at the center of the composition like a jewel. Charles reportedly did not eat it right away. The pineapple was a trophy, not a dessert. For decades afterward, European aristocrats rented pineapples for display at dinner parties, returning them to the supplier the next morning untouched. Growing one in Northern Europe required a heated greenhouse, a dedicated gardener, and years of patience. The flavor was beside the point. The fruit was proof that you could command the tropics from a dining room in London. Number 10. Venison pasties. Henry VIII of England was one of the most documented eaters in European history, and among the dishes most closely associated with his court was the venison pasty. Palace cooks took cuts of deer from the royal hunting grounds, seasoned them with salt, pepper, and cloves, wrapped them in a thick crust of pastry, and baked them until the filling was tender and the exterior hard enough to serve as its own plate. The pastry shell was not always meant to be eaten. It functioned as a container, keeping the meat sealed and moist during cooking. Venison was strictly controlled by English game laws. Only the king and those he granted permission could hunt deer in the royal forests, making the pasty a dish that carried legal weight before it even reached the table. Kitchen records from Hampton Court Palace document days when the household went through dozens of deer, hundreds of chickens, and thousands of eggs. The venison pasty was not a single meal. It was one small piece of a daily operation that fed a royal household numbering in the hundreds. Number 9. The Imperial Banquet of the Qing Dynasty. Emperors of China's Qing dynasty ate meals that could include dozens of individual dishes laid out in a precise arrangement dictated by court protocol. A typical imperial dinner featured roasted duck, braised sea cucumber, steamed dumplings, and plates of vegetables, pickles, and rice, all served simultaneously on color-coded porcelain that indicated rank. The emperor ate alone, seated behind a screen, and every dish was tasted before it reached the table. No single dish could be touched more than 3 times with the chopsticks, a rule designed to prevent anyone from learning the emperor's preferences and using them to poison a favorite food. Hundreds of staff worked in the palace kitchens. Much of the food was carried away, barely touched, and distributed to favored courtiers as a mark of honor. Receiving the emperor's leftovers was a privilege. Watching him eat was not permitted. Number 8. The Topkapi Palace Kitchen. The Ottoman sultans who ruled from Istanbul's Topkapi Palace maintained one of the largest royal kitchen operations in recorded history. At its peak, the palace kitchen complex employed hundreds of specialized cooks, divided into teams that handled bread, meat, sweets, beverages, and specific dishes for the sultan, the harem, and the palace staff. The kitchens had to feed thousands of people every day, from the sultan himself down to the lowest palace servant, and the hierarchy of what you ate told everyone exactly where you stood. The sultan's personal meals were prepared by a select team and tested by a designated taster. A typical imperial dinner included pilaf with saffron, roasted lamb, stuffed grape leaves, yogurt with herbs, pastries filled with nuts and honey, and fresh fruit carried overland from the empire's southern provinces. The spice trade that passed through Ottoman territory meant the palace kitchen had access to cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, and cardamom that most European courts could only dream of importing in those quantities. Sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent used the banquet table as a diplomatic tool. Foreign ambassadors were seated according to the dishes they were served, and the quality of your meal was a direct signal of how the Sultan viewed your country. An ambassador served lamb and saffron pilaf was in favor. One given a simpler plate knew where he stood without a word being spoken. The food did the talking, and the kitchen staff understood exactly what message they were preparing. Every plate that left the Topkapi kitchen was a political document disguised as dinner. Some surviving palace ledgers record individual ingredient inventories that stretch across hundreds of pages, tracking everything from the weight of sugar consumed in a single week to the number of sheep slaughtered on a festival day. Those records reveal a kitchen that operated less like a household and more like a small city's food supply. Number 7. The Feast of the Pheasant. In 1454, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, hosted a banquet in Lille that became one of the most documented feasts of the medieval world. The meal was never about the food. Mechanical fountains poured spiced wine. A live lion sat chained near the entrance. Guests ate roasted game and gilded pastries while performers staged scenes between courses. A roasted peacock arrived reassembled in its own feathers, beak painted gold. The meat was tough. Nobody cared. A giant pastry was cracked open to reveal 28 musicians playing inside. A model church held singers, one spectacle after another. Then, the climax. A live pheasant adorned with jewels was carried to the Duke on a platter. Philip and his knights swore on the bird to launch a crusade to the Holy Land. It never happened, but the pheasant gave the banquet its name, and the evening survived in chronicles as one of the most extravagant meals ever staged. Number 6. Mughal biryani. At the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great in 16th century India, the royal kitchen served a layered rice and meat dish that would become the ancestor of modern biryani. Court historians documented the emperor's interest in food and noted that the royal kitchen experimented constantly with combinations of basmati rice, slow-cooked lamb, saffron, cardamom, and fried onions, layered in a sealed pot and cooked over low heat until the flavors merged. The kitchen staff numbered in the hundreds, and the meals served at the Mughal court were designed to reflect the empire's reach across the subcontinent. Spices came from the south, rice from the river plains, and meat from the royal hunting reserves. Every ingredient in the dish traced a line back to a different corner of the empire. The biryani was not just a meal. It was a map of Mughal power, served in a single pot. Number 5. The private dining of Louis XIV. The same king who opened this video with his 4 plates of soup ate most of his meals in a ceremony called the Grand Couvert, where the French court watched him eat in silence. Louis XIV dined publicly nearly every evening, seated alone at a table while courtiers stood around the room and observed. The meal was not a social occasion. It was a performance of power. The king ate with his fingers for most of his life, as forks were still uncommon at the French court during his early reign. Courtiers recorded that he ate at extraordinary speed, chewing so little that his doctors warned him repeatedly about digestive problems. His appetite was genuine. The Duchess of Orleans, his sister-in-law, left detailed descriptions of meals where he consumed quantities of food that startled everyone who witnessed them. Yet for all the excess, the king's private tastes were simpler than the ceremony suggested. He returned frequently to basic stews, thick soups, and fresh fruit. The Grand Couvert was never about what he wanted to eat. It was about what everyone else needed to see him eat. Number 4. Cleopatra's dissolved pearl. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder recorded a story about Cleopatra VII of Egypt that has survived for more than 2,000 years. According to Pliny, Cleopatra wagered with the Roman general Mark Antony that she could spend a fortune on a single meal. She removed one of her pearl earrings, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, and drank the dissolved pearl. Whether the chemistry works as described is debated. Vinegar can break down calcium carbonate, which is what pearls are made of, but the process would take far longer than a few dramatic moments at a dinner table. Some historians believe the story was invented or embellished by later writers to illustrate Egyptian decadence for a Roman audience. Either way, it endured because it captured something that ran through every royal table on this list. The most extravagant meal was never about hunger. It was about proving that you could destroy something priceless and not flinch. Number 3. The coronation feast of George IV. When George IV was crowned King of England in 1821, the coronation feast held at Westminster Hall was one of the most excessive public meals in British history. Hundreds of dishes were prepared, including roasted venison, turtle soup, champagne jellies, spiced meats, and pastries stacked in towers across a banquet table that stretched the full length of the hall. The cost was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe the event running late, the food growing cold, and guests struggling to reach their seats in the crush of the crowd. George himself was already well known for his appetite. Years before his coronation, he had earned a reputation as the most self-indulgent prince in British memory, running up personal debts that required acts of parliament to resolve. The coronation feast was his first official act as king, and he used it to make a statement that no one present would forget. The statement, as it turned out, was that the new king intended to spend exactly as freely as the old prince always had. Number 2. The private suppers of Marie Antoinette. In the final years before the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette retreated from the rigid ceremony of Versailles to the Petit Trianon, a smaller residence on the palace grounds, where she hosted intimate suppers away from the full court. The menus reflected a shift in aristocratic taste: delicate pastries, fresh strawberries with cream, ices flavored with orange flower water, and lighter poultry dishes that replaced the heavy roasted joints of earlier reigns. The Queen preferred these small gatherings to the public spectacle of the royal table, where the King and Queen ate in front of an audience of courtiers and visiting commoners who were permitted to watch. Her preference for privacy became a weapon against her. Critics accused the Queen of hiding extravagant spending behind closed doors. Whether her personal expenses were truly exceptional compared to previous monarchs is still debated by historians, but the perception hardened into fact in the public mind. By the time the Revolution reached the palace gates, the banquet table at Versailles had become a symbol of everything the people wanted destroyed. The food was no longer a meal, it had become a verdict. Number 1. The last meal of Louis XVI. On the morning of January 21, 1793, Louis XVI of France was brought his final meal in the Temple prison in Paris. He had been sentenced to death by guillotine, and the execution was scheduled for later that morning. The meal, according to accounts from his attendants, was simple: roasted chicken, a glass of wine, and bread. Some accounts add vegetables, others reduce it further. The exact menu varies depending on the source, but every version agrees on one detail: the king ate calmly. He was 48 years old. He had ruled France since the age of 19, inherited a nation already drowning in debt, and spent the years of his reign watching the monarchy's authority collapse faster than he could respond. By the time he sat down to that plate of chicken in the Temple, the palace at Versailles had been emptied. The Queen was imprisoned in a separate cell, and the country he once governed had voted to remove him permanently. He finished the meal. He was taken by carriage to the Place de la Révolution, where a crowd of thousands had gathered. According to witnesses, he attempted to address the crowd, but the drums were ordered to drown out his voice. The blade fell just after 10 in the morning. The meal he had eaten an hour earlier was ordinary: chicken and bread and wine, the kind of food any French household might have served on any given weekday. There was no gold plate, no subtlety sculpted from sugar, no taster standing by. For the first time in his life, a king of France ate a meal that looked like everyone else's. And that meal was his last. His queen, Marie Antoinette, would be executed 9 months later. She refused her final meal entirely. She drank a cup of chocolate and left the rest untouched. The palace kitchens that had fed them both were already cold by then. Every fire in Versailles had gone out the night the royal family was taken, and the ovens that once roasted swans and sculpted sugar into castles never lit again for a king. That final plate of chicken and bread sat at the end of a line stretching back thousands of years, from emmer wheat in the Nile Valley to sugar castles at the court of Elizabeth. Every dish on this list was real. If one of these meals caught you off guard, drop it in the comments. And if you have made it this far, hit subscribe.